Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you. Welcome to week two of our 8 weeks together. I hope everybody is doing well. I hope wherever you are safe, healthy, and thriving. And I'm just going to get right into it. This week, we are looking at the progression of events that Luther no doubt helped contribute. I wouldn't necessarily say he was the spark, but he certainly was a contributing catalyst to the eventuation of events that would, spur themselves in Western Europe. And today we are going to be looking at that next evolution, which is going to be the Enlightenment. And because this is an 8 week class, I am diluting quite a bit. Yes, there are entire books and lectures and research upon research upon research that you can do on the Enlightenment. You can pick it apart. You can look at various individuals, momentous events. But remember, for the purposes of this course, we are looking at the issue of how various events from the Reformation all the way to the present have contributed to our ideas of freedom. And last week we looked at the idea of the individual, how exactly that comes about with those radical ideas and notions that Luther had in terms of removing the church from that process of self-determination, right? That truly who you are and what you want to be is not determined by the Pope or the church or anything like that. It is determined by you. As long as you have this option to have a relationship with God, it is out there. You choose to be a good person, you too can be worthy of God's goodness and forgiveness and all of that. That's precisely what Luther was talking about. But in that removal of an authority, what Luther is doing is he's opening up the possibilities to other ways of thinking about the self, the world, systems of rule, right? And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at a couple of those in the Enlightenment. Okay. So some of the objectives that we're going to try to cover is that we're going to look at the Enlightenment as a totalitizing experience in terms of world history. We're going to look at how the Enlightenment really how various events, create this sort of synchronous, I would call it like it's almost like a dance, right? These ideas that are happening during this period, the inventions, the technology, the theories, the philosophies, the discussions, the interactions with each other. It's all creating this sort of movement that is eventually going to lead to other major momentous experiences in world history. And then, of course, we're going to look at the long-term legacy. And what the legacy is how the Enlightenment really added to and further enhanced our sense of self. It provided these ideas and greater openings for bringing in and critiquing those dogmas that have so tied people and institutions into very narrow forms of performativity. And so, what the Enlightenment does is it opens up the possibility, right? The possibility that there may be other forms of government, the possibility that there may be other ways in which somebody can achieve success or individuality or sense of purpose, and that there's technologies as well as systems of methodological scientific evaluation that can allow us to no longer decide or to allow that faith needs to be our only determining factor, but that we can prove through various processes that yes, this is indeed in fact true. Okay, so let's take a look. To define the Enlightenment, all right, it is I think that it's fair to begin with this idea that the Enlightenment, for all historical purposes, has largely been tied to a European invention, manifestation, experience. Um, and I think that there is plenty in which we can certainly attribute achievements, experiences, and goals. I mean, I don't think that it's unwise for us to at least recognize the influence of Western European culture on the world, especially its systems of governance as well as its economies. But that's not necessarily to say that that's a good thing. Okay, so given the Eurocentric narrative that has existed in the historical telling of this period in Western Europe, I think it's very fair to say that we must be able to recognize that the achievements that happened during this period between the 17th century and all the way up until some people would say the early 19th century, um, that these were building off of other ideas. Okay. And I will give some recognition at the end. But here in the beginning, I would like to just emphasize that none of this was created in a vacuum, that, Europeans were definitely influenced and had access to ideas that were coming from China, from the Middle East, from North Africa. And there isn't this idea that all of this was just sort of created out of nothing. They are influenced by the preserved texts in Greek, as well as under from the Greeks, or whether it was the Romans, as well as from the as people in the Middle East, especially the Islamic empires, that these ideas were helped to spur on and further other ideas. Okay. So it's not that, and as we'll see with some of the inventions and the theories, I will point out to you where exactly some of those other ideas were being borrowed from and enhanced further. But to be clear, the Enlightenment you can look at the Enlightenment in basically like three different ways. Like if you want to look at it as a narrative. So the most common way that is taught is that the Enlightenment is a gift, right? It's that the Europeans did a bunch of great things and they gave it to the world, and this is the reason why the world is the way that it is. That's one way of telling it. But I think I wouldn't necessarily just say that it was all great and roses and chocolate, that there are some challenges, to these quote unquote gifts. And I think that's where the next part comes in, is that the second narrative of the Enlightenment is really that this is a period in which given the philosophical, economic, and political constructions of this period definitely lent themselves to the eventual experiences of whether we have, racialized slavery, the oppression and destruction of non-white and non-European cultures. And so, it's very important that, especially like when we think about that, is that the Enlightenment period, when all of this, incredible advancement and deep reflective thought and technology is taking place, this is also, the period of increased racial oppression, slavery, the transatlantic trade, in terms of slaves, we're the expansion of European empires, imperialism. So, this is not just like, hey, it's all good. It's a total gift, because depending on what side you are on the receiving end of those quote unquote gifts, this may look like an absolute curse. Okay. So it's fair enough to say that. And then the third way is to look at that this Enlightenment period is really one of several in a developmental sort of aspect, because there is plenty of research to suggest that you could call the Islamic Golden Age, which is roughly from the 8th century all the way to the 13th century, right, is a period of incredible advancements in technology, in mathematics, in art, in literature, in music. So you could make that argument. You could also make a similar argument in terms of the achievements that were made under the Song Dynasty or under the Ming Dynasty. I mean, even for a time, for much of Europe's history. If we are to look at that, like if we take a look at even just some of the maps from the 13th century in Europe, the ways in which uh, kings, empires in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia are described, you can clearly see that Europeans had an admiration for this. I mean, even to go back even further, the very term civilization is a Greek word, and it comes from the Greek of civilize, meaning what Greeks were using or what they used to term that, right, is based off of what they saw in Egypt, right? They saw a system where there was a government, there was a head of state, a pharaoh. There were various bureaucratic organizations to help run the empire, and there was a system of stability, a system of writing, a system of laws, right? That's the term civilization, and it was used to describe what the Greeks were looking at, right? And so it's for us to think that the Enlightenment is somehow a singular experience, I think is very, very short-sighted. Of course, it does, if that's the narrative that you tell, then of course, then it completely just supports, the second version as well. So, that's the reason why I think it's more effective for us to look at how ideas of the self, how freedom, how laws, how this idea of the individual really are about developmental aspects in history. Why? Because these are ideas. Remember, when people interact with each other, they share a lot of things. They share ideas, they share culture, they share food, right? They share each other. Okay. So remember, there's always that interaction, and that interaction spurns other ideas, right? The interaction of ideas creates others. And so the Enlightenment, for all intents and purposes, for us to look at it, is really the culmination of other world knowledge, other, areas of expertise and ideas that have been developed over time, right? I mean, you can't create calculus without algebra, okay? And algebra is an invention in the Middle East. Okay, so as much as we like to credit Newton with this fantastic way of calculating planetary orbits using making calculus, he had to get this information and this math from somewhere, and he borrows that math from other previous thinkers. Okay, so we have to be able to recognize that yes, have Europeans created enduring legacies in art, literature, history, politics, philosophy? Absolutely. But where exactly did they borrow and get some of those ideas in which to develop from? Okay. You can't just stand on the shoulders of giants and just say that, hey, I did it on my own. No, this is a natural progression in terms of humanity. Okay. So let's consider that. So when you look at these narratives, right, I just want you to be really thinking about this and take a look at the videos that I have attached here on China and the Middle East. They're pretty interesting. And then of course, if you just type in like the Islamic Golden Age, there's a fascinating one on PBS. I don't know if the video is still up, but you could even go onto YouTube and they have some other ones as well. So, definitely take a look. Some fascinating stuff. So when we're thinking of the people of this period, right? From the 15th century all the way up until, the 16th, 17th, 18th century, right? What we want to be able to think about are the people and the ideas that they were pushing, okay? Because these are individuals that are going to be referred to not just for the period in the 18th and 19th century, but the 20th and the 21st century. And so when we look at it in terms of like people, what we're talking about with people and their ideas is that when Luther opened up this idea to question how an authority, the church, could determine one's place, one's direction, one's experience in this life, when he questioned that, it opened up the opportunity for other people to question other things. So you have people like Voltaire, who questions this idea in terms of like, what does it mean to be free? What does it mean to have freedom of religion? What does it mean to be able to have this sense of personhood. If you look at people like Rousseau, he's an individual that built off of sociological thought that had been developed under a person by the name of Averroes, a Middle Easterner in North Africa and Morocco. And, he's questioning this idea of like, well, what does it mean in which to have the people governed? What does it mean to be an effective leader? What does it mean, to be able to have a system of government where all people are treated with equality before the law, right? Montesquieu as well, separation of powers, John Locke in terms of limited government, and of course, Immanuel Kant, right, who uses reason as a way to investigate and better understand the living world. Okay. So all of these ideas are really tied up into what we think today is like, well, that's just standard. Isn't that just the way that it is? Even with the push against it from our current, government and government officials who, are questioning like, well, are all people really free? Should all people really be free? Do they all deserve equality before the law? Or is it just some people, like the people who can afford it, right? These are questions that really during the 18th century, 17th and 18th century were being called into question. That people were like, well, wait a second, can really a king just decide to do whatever he wants to do whenever he wants to do it? There's nothing that can stop him, right? These are the things that are being questioned because of Luther being able to create that little trigger right now, opened up the door. And so, you can take a look at each of these individuals, it'll take you to a link or a video about them. But, some really interesting stuff. But really, some of the major events that you should really think about, because these are things that we're going to be returning to in subsequent lectures, is that we want to look at, some of the processes and the systems which allow us to come to conclusions that are based on a methodology, as well as the theories in terms of organization, whether they are in government, whether they are in systems of bureaucracy, whether they are in terms of the laws or even people. And so when you're looking at these ideas, like, you have Descartes, with his philosophies, and you guys have heard it before, this idea, I think, therefore I am. What Descartes is arguing in this aspect is this notion that there is no sense of consciousness without my first recognition of it, right? That the recognition of who I am and what I am is the beginning of that sort of individualization, right? That sense of personhood, that sense of self, which can lead to that self-determination, right? But at the same time that you have people like Descartes, you also have people like Francois Bernier, right? Who at the same time in 1684 is actually creating what we call and term race today, right? This idea that race is actually based on something biological, that there are actually different types of races, right? Now, of course, Francois Bernier and all subsequent quote unquote scientists that try to claim that race is an actual real thing, whether it is biological, whether it is, cultural, whether it is social, right? These are all aspects in which this is constructed, right? There is no biological race, okay? These divisions, whether it's Francois Bernier or if it's, Blumenbach, these or even Carl Linnaeus, these are individuals who are coming up and creating a social construction in terms of delineating differences based off of what is appeared, right? What is to be seen, darker skin, language, behaviors, right? These are these sort of ideas that are culminating during this period. So, and it's very important to understand this because this is one of the things that gives rise and justification to this idea that, well, of course, Europeans are better. Look at what we have. Look at our technology, look at our resources, look at our systems of government, and look at what all these other people have, right? It allows for this devaluation of the end and this creation of the other, right? Because at the same time that we're creating these ideas of individuality and equality before the law and systems of, divine governance, we're in these ideas of like the social contract, right? Or, the rights of man, right? At the same time, we are removing those same senses of equality and opportunity from other people, right? As a justification in terms of that classification and that order of degree in terms of worth. All right. So very important to recognize that. And so, as I said before, consider where exactly and what exactly those areas are coming from. Because even with the previous periods of advancement throughout human history, these ideas have carried, right? Whether that is, Christopher Columbus using maps that had been created in China, whether that is, Averroes's ideas inspiring people like Descartes or, Montesquieu or, individuals like, John Locke, right? These are individuals who are reading other things. And what's very key is that you should always consider, like, well, who are these great thinkers reading, right? Where are they getting their ideas from? Where are they building from? Because nothing is created in a vacuum, people. Never at all, right? And at the same time that people are creating incredible ideas in terms of equality, opportunity, self-determination, they are also simultaneously creating oppression, destruction, and manipulation. Okay. So this is, it's not all, good and gravy here. So, be able to consider that. And when we're thinking about that, we want to be able to look at how these ideas of carry and how they influence other ideas. Because in the subsequent two lectures on the American Revolution and the French Revolution, they are definitely borrowing from people during this period in terms of justifying why exactly they're taking the actions they are to divorce themselves from the government that is that from which they are under, or if it is or if it is to throw off the chains of monarchy, as we will see. Okay, so take a look.